Hello, everyone, and welcome to a special April Fool's edition of the Unwelcome Access podcast. I am your host, Ross Edelstein, as always, and today we are going to be talking about humor. Now, it's April Fool's Day. That is sort of our big reason why we're here, right? However, I did want to approach this from less of a practical joke perspective, more of a let's talk about how disability and humor have evolved over the years perspective. On the screen here, you have a photo from the Illinois Railway Museum, and there is a white rail car, a passenger car. It's very old and in not great condition. The windows are boarded up with plywood, but painted on the side are some words. America's Finest Midway, James E. Straight's Shows. It's a circus train, which I thought was perfectly appropriate for the humor episode. But let's go ahead and start with story time with Ross. So on the screen, we have my normal photo for this segment, me driving a locomotive, looking like I am very angry, very focused, sitting in a chair, but having the time of my life. When we're talking about humor, I want to start with one of the first times I disclosed I was autistic in the workplace. Now, today I really can't help but do that. But when I was 18, fresh-faced, far less bearded, and far more hair on my head, I could. I wasn't openly autistic, and I was starting really as an adult in the workplace. In this case, at Taco Bell. Now, this is the end of my first year of undergrad. I was mostly doing work in the lobby, cashier work, cleaning up, etc. Normal types of things. And this was a relatively light day, so I was in the back of the house, sort of shooting the shit with some coworkers. Now, keep in mind, I'm 19. This coworker is 17, a senior in high school. So we're getting along. I get along with most of my coworkers and always have, but we're getting along very well, making jokes back and forth. I say something stupid, probably a bad pun or something, and this coworker asks, "What are you, autistic?" Meaning it in a derogatory way. My response, deadpan, yes. It took them a moment, but they started apologizing, realizing I was serious. I lost all of my shit. My sides were splitting. I couldn't stop laughing for a good 10 minutes. To me, it was one of the funniest things that had ever happened to me. Looking back, it's a really great example of how humor often is used in a very ableist way. But let's dive into more of that. And this should be a relatively short episode. But let's start by recapping disability models. Now, on the right, I have a photo of the drivers and steamworks of nickel plate 765. So you've got black metal, various pistons and round bits, along with various metal supports. You also have the locomotive sort of billowing out smoke from the side on the lower left of the image. But let's hit on the disability models real quick. Now, I go into these a lot more in an earlier episode, but when we talk about the models, the two big ones are the medical and the social model. Medical model. Disability is a feature of a person. It is inherent to them, and all the barriers they face are because of the disability in themselves. It needs to be cured and addressed on that individual basis. Social model. Disability is a feature of a person, but what is disabling under the social model is societal choices and behaviors. So when I say that, right, you look at things like buildings as a great example. Medical model. Someone who can't get upstairs, if there's a building with steps, well, they can't get in because their disability prevents them from using the steps. Some under the social model, you're asking, why has this building decided to ignore accessibility laws and best practices when it was built in 1998? Why has this building basically made the choice that they don't want disabled customers or people coming into there? Things like that. Things that look at a sort of broader, other people are making choices that lead to barriers thing. Oftentimes, things are in the middle. But one of the reasons I bring this up again is that we're talking about the social model, right? And that those choices, the way that you perceive disability, is affected by everything you get into, everything you learn, everything you create, etc. So when I say that it's often in the middle, this is one of those where we're really going to be focusing in on the social aspects, how choices that other people make impact disabled people. So let's start by asking ourselves, what is comedy anyway? Now, when we talk about comedy, right, I want to go way back to the Greek tragedy of comedy. Aristophanes, more like Aristophanes nuts, so on and so forth. This is a tradition that isn't too far off from what we have today. For example, the sitcom is kind of just the Greek comedy into the modern era. That said, Greek comedy sort of has this exaggerated stereotype that is the core of it, as well as a lot of innuendo and dirty jokes. It's also based heavily on irreverence. So, for example, hey, there is this very respected figure, we're going to make fun of them. A lot of satire involved. There's also exaggerated happy endings. So, compared to tragedies where everybody dies and nobody's happy, comedy is the comically bad guy who has various traits that are played up for how they're so bad, dies, and everybody's happy. They also probably died in a slapstick way with a pie to the face. Today, when we talk about comedy, we're really talking about effects, things that make people laugh, right? So, this oftentimes has very similar backgrounds when you're talking about movies, TV shows, which is what we're going to really focus in on for a lot of modern stuff. But at the end of the day, there's things like stand-up. There's things that are comedic that mean nothing. For example, on the screen is one of the funniest images that I've ever taken. Not because there's anything particularly funny here. It's a metro locomotive pulling gallery cars going through a station, and it's one of their F-59 PHIs. What's funny is that this is the Amtrak California paint scheme. Not because Metra just really liked it and wanted to use it. No, because this locomotive is former Amtrak California, crashed, and Metra, deciding to be essentially the EMD capital of the world, did the "is for me" meme, which I might throw in post, but bought it, decided they didn't want to bother with repainting the thing, and just touched up the paint scheme and kept it. That, to me, is incredibly funny. To others, it might not be funny at all. But comedy is a very wide thing. Humor is super wide. That said, today we're really going to focus on the ways that are more formalized as opposed to autistic man finds train thing funny. So when we're talking about disability and comedy, I've tried to pick generally neutral train images here. On the right, we have the South Shoreline at South Bend, with a locomotive sitting in the station behind a ADA-compliant ramp and platform. Historically, disabled people have been the butt of the joke. Now, there's a lot of reasons behind this, and we'll talk about the why. But growing up, autism was a schoolyard slur. Heck, at 18, the joke that made me disclose autism with a sort of counter joke was, hey, you're acting autistic. It's often used as an insulting joke, and a lot of jokes can be insulting, right? Going back to what comedy is, you have the Aristophanes portraying Plato, where he's making a fool of him. A lot of these comedic portrayals of disabilities also will use slurs. And when we're talking about this, I want to bring up, and I've cited it before, I'll include it as well, the Cloak of Incompetence. Excellent, excellent article. Highly recommend reading it. But there is a visibility that is often added to disability that is intended to highlight it and play up these traits of disability. Oftentimes that comes with saying slurs. The movie Tropic Thunder, the blackface in there got less blowback from everything I've seen than the extreme use of the R word. Now, the movie basically has gone back and defended this from day one. And while they added in a please don't say the R word bit at the end, well, saying things like that still stigmatizes it, right? But also, historically, there have been other ways that it's been portrayed. Court jesters and fools are a big part of it. There is a great video. I do not have it off the top of my head. I will put it in the description once I figure it out, or if anybody here knows that video, put it in the comments and I'll pin it. But oftentimes, court jesters and fools had disability involved, right? The fool, in particular, is somebody who was chosen for what we would probably today call intellectual disability. Now, go back to the autism episode real quick before we get into any of that, because the big thing to remember there is that we can't specifically diagnose any disabilities. But for the nature of these people being likely having an intellectual disability, they were seen as harmless ways to joke at the king or whoever. But that still has an ableist bent. Well, obviously they aren't capable of understanding that you shouldn't make fun of the king. That kind of still says, well, they are not capable. They should not be given the same rights as others, or treated the same, or given any sort of support to be at the same level as everyone else. But before we get into some more specific examples from the current day, I do want to go ahead and put our halfway point here. Go ahead and take it over. Mid-roll Ross? Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming. I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. All right, now we're back, and on the screen, I wanted to point out that I've never seen South Park, but this was the best example of disabled people being the butt of the joke that I could find, where we're really showing some of those very specific ways that you have that sort of, well, disabled people are funny and able to be made fun of. Now, I believe these characters are Jimmy and Timmy. I do not know which one is which, as again, I've never actually watched South Park. But on the right, we have a kid in a wheelchair who has basically been strapped into it. It has a very large head. Um, and you have in the middle of the three characters on the screen a kid who is using crutches, and essentially his legs are shown as weird and floppy. I feel bad saying that, but that's the portrayal. And also, his eyes are not aligned to look at the other characters. These are offensive stereotypes. It's the, hey, let's portray disabled people as funny for their physical or behavior presentations. And I'm going to go ahead and get off this because I really do not like this too much, which is why I have a photo of the NOMA station in Washington, D.C., with an Amtrak train coming past it in the background, and various buildings rising up taken from the Red Line metro platform. That said, I do want to highlight that oftentimes it's punching down, right? Usually, the best example of this I can point to of what punching down is really is the SpongeBob episode where SpongeBob does comedy stand up at the Krusty Krab and makes jokes about Sandy, a squirrel, who is a minority in Bikini Bottom. Yes, I just made that reference. It it's 100% true though. SpongeBob then starts punching to the side at the end of that episode, as opposed to focusing on somebody who is very much an other, right? The reality is that a lot of punching down is easy for comedy. You aren't going to get pushback from somebody who is minoritized. So, for example, the idea is, well, if I make fun of a disabled person, well, nobody who has any power to actually do something about it is necessarily going to push back. Now, this has changed over the last few years. Anybody who says they've been canceled for making fun of disabled people, that's not a bad thing. The reality is that a lot of this pushback that has just finally started to catch up with really comedy in general is long overdue, because this is one of the ways that you perpetuate stereotypes. The other part is that behavior and social patterns that are outside of the norm, which a lot of disabled people, regardless of what the disability is, have, that's often seen as funny, right? So anything from, for example, Forrest Gump, or the character portrayed in Tropic Thunder, or so on and so forth. it's not just that they have the thing that shows that they're disabled, it's that they are behaving in a way that puts them as a part of the out group, right? Makes it really easy to say, well, isn't that funny? Especially if you aren't a part of that group. Now, there's also bullies, and a lot of bullies will use disability to make fun of people. Think of the old "hey, four eyes" stereotype. There's a lot of people who will choose, for funny, quote unquote, reasons, to make fun of a disability because they know that for a lot of people, because they have been otherwise stigmatized, these jokes are going to cut deep. And in a lot of cases, people don't necessarily push back on that, not because they think it's wrong, but because humans are a group animal. We're social creatures. And when you are portraying someone as part of an out group, it's a lot easier to be complicit with behavior that harms somebody. And so not only does this punching down add into that out group status, it also reinforces this to others, right? So when you have somebody doing comedy stand-up that's talking about disabled people who isn't disabled themselves, it often reinforces these ideas that, well, disabled people are less somehow. That said, I want to sort of end on a positive note. And this is a photo of one, I believe, Metro Center in Washington, D.C., one of their underground stations. So it has the beautiful, brutalist sort of train temple tunnels with the almost waffle appearance overarching the station, with a rail car on the opposite track from where I am standing, and lights coming up, but the lights from below are blocked by the train, so part of the ceiling is dark. Now, I'll have an example to end this of really good disability humor. But disabled comedians are good. A lot of disabled comedians will utilize their own experiences to make the jokes. This isn't punching down, right? There is an element of, I can say this about myself and my own experience that comes from being a part of a marginalized group. Now, there is a difference as well from I am autistic and I think autistic people are dumb and stupid, etc. type humor, and the kind of thing that really is the more how about them trains and autistic people type stuff, right? There is a lot with that humor that is generally more about, hey, let's talk about the exaggeration of this experience to highlight what that experience is like. Oftentimes, that humor reflects on the situations of ableism, as opposed to painting that disabled people as the butt of the joke, right? So I have a really good example of this that I'm going to play after, and I'll link to Joe Wells's channel as well. Joe Wells is an autistic comedian from the UK. Absolutely hilarious guy. That said, it is the perfect example of, let's take the situation of ableism and turn it on its head. And the other part is that a lot of disabled humor and humor involving disabled people doesn't have to involve the disability, right? Disabled people are people who are disabled, not necessarily people who are only about their disability. When we're talking about helping people live full, welcoming lives, that's a huge part of it too. That being said, thanks for watching. We're going to go ahead and end it here. Again, this is a much shorter episode than most, but I wanted to go ahead and hand it over to Joe Wells to give a great example to end this of good autism humor.
I'm Joe, I'm an autistic man. We got autistics then? No! People were killed off during the pandemic. It's fine. We've got DNRs on our files, that's fine. No, I am properly diagnosed and everything, so if you heckle me, then technically that is a hate crime. Just be aware of that. Yes, I can perform to not autistic people. I'm not like not autistic. My brother's not autistic. He's very severely not autistic. He's got all the symptoms. He loves making eye contact. He's really into loud, sudden noises. He's shit at maths. That last one's not fair. That's not true. It's not true that not autistic people are shit at maths. A lot of you can be really good at maths. With the right support, you can achieve it. He's incredible, my brother. You know, he's not autistic, but he's and it's no one's fault he's not autistic. My parents are very supportive of both of us. They loved him and cared for him. They gave him the MMR vaccine. That's supposed to help, but he's still not autistic. And he's achieved incredible things for a not autistic person. He went to university, which I think is amazing for a not autistic person. I mean, obviously, he had to have like a specialist course that was adapted to meet his needs. It's called Film and Media Studies.
A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and you'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode. Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.